Good morning. Thank you so much for coming. It's my honor to chair the first panel discussion, Adaptation of Immigrants in Their New Social Milieu. Our first speaker now will be Dr. Madhulika Khandelwal, and she is the director at the Asian American Center at Queens College, City University of New York, where she has been teaching for many years as a professor. And the topic of her discussion is inclusion and engagement, immigrant leaders and civic participation in multicultural Queens, New York. Please welcome her.
So good morning, everyone. I do want to begin by really expressing my gratitude to be invited to speak at this conference. Thank you so much to Professor Eme and all the other organizers. And I also want to spend a moment thanking the President and the opening remarks that, of welcome that we got. For this topic, for this very important topic, I think it's more than framing. I think it's like setting the tone for what this discussion could mean today and in the future as well, right? So, a little bit about myself. I come from Queens. I have been working on Queens communities for 30-some years, and I myself am an immigrant from India. And what I'm going to talk about today is some of the ways that we should look at immigrant communities also. And also include the perspectives of immigrants themselves in these things, and not only look at them as a subject matter, but also listen to them. And I think that would be the right way of having a dialogue and kind of partnership where immigrants are included in these programs and projects that we have to make for a better, I would say, more effective multicultural civic society, right? So what I want to talk about today is about immigrant leaders in Queens. I do want to say that, even though Brooklyn is very diverse, and it's just such a joy to come here and interact with all of you. It's just in the other borough, right? It's neighbors, but still it opens up so many new things. So I'm going to talk about immigrant leaders in Queens, and also discuss a little bit about their roles in creating these shared spaces in our civic life. So Queens is now close to 50% foreign-born people, immigrants. Right? So this is about half the borough, right? And this is a result of this immigration that we call post-1965 immigration, because the immigration laws changed in this country in 1965 and the years following right after that. So and that really made, for those of you who do not know about this 1965 immigration law, I just want to mention quickly is that this is when the US immigration gets transformed and opens up to the entire world for the first time in US history. So it has been a nation of immigrants, right? New York City has been a city of immigrants. We know that. But the diversity that we are talking about is about 50 years old in this country, right? So that creates its own dynamics. The kind of diverse communities that we are talking about, the culturally diverse, communities that are very intense, complex, right? We should look at the last 50 years, what has happened. And we are seeing that in the neighborhoods, in the organizations, all kinds of places, we are seeing the impact of this immigration. So in Queens, there are neighborhoods where people speak more than 50 or sometimes 100 languages, right? and they're coexisting. They're not divided into these exclusive neighborhoods. I do want to mention this is also the post-civil rights period, right? Where, we are trying to be in desegregated conditions, right? And also there are issues about equality and human rights that are legal now, that are on the board, right? So we are living in very different political, social conditions in US history. And we have to kind of really appreciate that, what's going on. So very diverse people, big amount of foreign-born populations, and people who are called generally what I would say foreigners and therefore aliens. So these terms are being used a lot. And what I am saying here is that if in a borough or in a city where close to 50% of the people are immigrants, foreign-born, we cannot put all of them, this is about 1 million people in Queens, okay? We cannot put all of them in this homogeneous box of foreign-born alien people. There are people who have not only come from different parts of the world there, as I said, right? But also people who have lived here for 30 years, for 40 years, right? And they have, not all of them to the same degree, but quite a few of them have stepped out and they have been participating in multicultural civic bodies. What about them? Can we just disregard that? You know what President said about the younger generation? I fully agree with him. I mean, my students come from these communities, really, and I'm passionate about the bicultural identities of young people growing up in these kind of conditions. I'm very, very aware of that, and I really deal with this on an everyday basis. But I also want to mention is that we cannot have an amnesia about 50 years of these populations and just suddenly jump to the younger generation, because the background of the younger generation is also provided what has been happening in terms of these immigrant communities. These are their families, these are their communities they have grown up in. So we have to understand that also. Okay. So I want to quickly tell you is that if you look at the literature on immigrant communities, you will find studies of ethnic groups, right, of cultural and racial groups, but for the whole community as such, what their distinct characteristics are, what their organizations are, those kind of things, right? We do not hear that much about the leadership in these communities. And we are beginning to, in the last 15, 20 years, we are beginning to see an effort from these communities themselves to talk about what's happening within their own populations. For example, like South Asians, they would talk about domestic violence. They would talk about youth groups, why we need these groups, right? So this is coming from the immigrants themselves. They are taking a lead in that and having a dialogue on these topics. So we hear about organizations, community organizations that are doing this work, which is great. And some of these people are my partners in crime, and I really have a lot of respect for the work that they do every day, right? But also, I want to mention there are immigrants who are almost, I would say, independent of the organizations, and they are active in the local civic life as well. They are active in the community boards. Are you familiar with the community boards, right? New York City has this, I would say, almost like a unique institution of having community boards in all the boroughs, right? And these are local leaders, right? Who deal with land use issues, in what's happening in neighborhoods, very, very grassroots level bodies, civic bodies. And I'm going to that level, okay? I'm going to that neighborhood grassroots level. And there you see immigrants participating. Not that many, as the demographics are way ahead. I mean, there are very, very rapid changes in demographics, as I said, like more than half of the people. In some neighborhoods, 60, 70% of the population in a neighborhood would be immigrants, right? As a whole in the borough, about 50%, right? So the demographics are going ahead very fast. Are we trying to catch up with those demographics and see how these immigrant groups are represented in the bodies like community boards? There are efforts towards that direction. Still a long way to go, but but we are seeing some people there, and I want to talk about that. That these people who are kind of pioneers in that way, because they are interacting with what you can call Americans, people who have been here longer, right, and are not foreign-born, right. Also, the other aspect I want to mention are public officials. Now, these are city council people whom we elect for these local positions, right? And they are also, their offices should be considered as spaces that are trying to reach out to these immigrant populations for obvious reasons. They are like the voting that these immigrants have, and not all of them are citizens, but they are becoming citizens, right? And they are registering to vote. So this is a process we are seeing. This cannot be put in one box and like a frozen kind of reality, right? And so the public officials are trying to reach out. They do multicultural festivals, they do holidays, observations of like different groups, right? And they're trying to reach out, right? My question is, are we really having enough shared spaces where people can come together and push this forward? I would say the multicultural civic spaces. So, while this is part of my research that has been going on for some time in seeing how Queens is changing, what role immigrants play in these communities, the core of my research that I'm doing, I want to talk about that for this presentation, is interviews with 6 such immigrant leaders. And these are interviews that I conducted, these are unstructured interviews. So there are stories. We talked about stories, the significance of stories. So while we have quite a bit of quantitative data, right, the numbers and this and that, right, which is good, but we also need, with the numbers, human stories. We need to hear from people what is going on, right, from their perspective. So I conducted these interviews, and I sat down with these people. As I said, they're unstructured interviews. And I heard their stories, what has happened. And I have known these people for some time of their involvement. But now I was hearing in depth, and I'm still in contact with them, and I'm finding out from them. So a few things about them. These immigrant leaders, they are from different countries of Asia. Just to give you a quick breakdown, there is a Korean person, there is a Chinese person, Taiwanese Chinese person, there is somebody from Bangladesh, somebody from India, somebody from Guyana, whom we call Indo-Caribbeans because of their Indian ancestry, and let me see, and a Filipina person. Okay, so these are these give you an idea. They're all Asians, and yet you can see how diverse they are, right? So when I say Asian, people have all kinds of images, about Asians, like whether they're Chinese or what. But Asians are a very, very diverse group. So within these groups, you have all these diversities happening. And what these leaders are telling me is, one, that they're very rooted, I've seen that, very rooted in their own traditions and cultures, and sometimes religious, like faiths that they come from, right? And they are transferring, they're transplanting those faiths here, right? And so they want to be in those faiths. They're not, most of them are not converting, okay? They're very particular about those things. These are the traditions they are bringing. And yet, from that base, they are reaching out to people of other faiths, of other cultures. And they want to have more and more of these dialogues. Okay? How do they enter this space? It's very heartening to see that, a civic leader from an organization that existed already would say, you know, you have a large community here, can I talk to you about how to reach to them? And that's how some of these things began, and then grew and grew, and they became networks, really. You know? I'm saying this because some of you are already in these organizations, some of you are children of these immigrants, some of you will start organizations like these that will create more and more of these shared spaces, right? And the third thing I want to say is, if we look at their experiences, they're all, I think all of them are community board members in different neighborhoods of Queens. And all of them participated, and they're still members of what is called the Queens General Assembly. So this is the public official part. So there was a Queensborough president, Helen Marshall, who's an African-American, who was of African-American origin. She passed away a few years ago. And she, coming from Guyana, she said, I'm so familiar with what happens in immigrant families. It's my first-hand experience, and I want to reach out to Queens, people like immigrants in Queens, all of them, and really create these, as I call it, shared spaces. What's one of the scholars of Mexican immigration in New York City, Robert Smith, calls model multicultural spaces. I mean, we are looking for terms. We don't know what to call these spaces, really. I'm telling you, it's like, you know, all this is happening, and yet we're like, how do we say this? How do we talk about these things? So, I think we all need to, how much time do we have? Yeah, okay. So, we are in these places where we are seeing these changes happen, and yet what I'm saying is we have to listen to the immigrants also to hear the other side of the story, you know, right? And these immigrants that I'm talking about are now, they are all elderly. Many of them are retired, and yet they are still very active. They're quite active for their age. I know people who are, you know, in these immigrants who are in their 80s, and they are like, you know, I really want to pass on this legacy of shared spaces, of multicultural Queens to the younger generations. And that's why they agreed to talk to me, because they were like, oh, will you write about us, what we are trying to do, what we have been trying to do for 30-some years of our lives. Also, in some cases, I saw their children who were trained in these kind of, you know, immigrant families by their parents, right? They picked up the baton, if you want to put it that way, and they are carrying it forward. So what happens is, very often when we look at the younger generation, right, leaders, and as I said, many of them are my friends and colleagues and partners in the work that we do, we find that their parents had a lot to do with the kind of atmosphere they created for them at home, you know. So we have to look at these immigrants also in that. I just want to mention, think of how to close, because that's the time I have, and I really look forward to more discussion on this. So I think we should look for academic efforts, right? Research, community-oriented research in New York City neighborhoods, in New York City, you know, communities, whether it's Brooklyn or Queens or some other places, or the New York City area itself, as urban spaces where we are seeing these people come together, right? Old, and what Professor Sanjek, Roger Sanjek, is an anthropologist who was teaching at Queens College, and is the first person to really look at how New York City neighborhoods like Elmer's Corona in Queens, he was the first one to say, look at that, this demographic transition is what the country is going through. It is not just New York City even, not Queens at all, it's whole New York City, but not even New York City. The whole country is moving in that direction, right? So if we want to build a future, we have to consider these kind of issues, and what role do immigrants have to play in this? So his book, Professor Roger Sanjek, some of you can look him up. He wrote this book, published this book about 20 years ago, called The Future of Us All. And in that he discusses what he calls the new Immigrants and Old Americans. It was a project that he kind of developed. In fact, I was a student as a young person, a young scholar. I started working under him about 30 some years ago, looking at how the populations were changing in Queens, right? So these are kind of projects that bring people together, and we see the intergroup relations, right? So it's not just about immigrants. And what I'm saying is that I think we are at a point where we should challenge some of the traditional kind of research models on immigrants that divide them by ethnic groups only. Like you just look at separate communities, right? Or they look at the younger generation only, right? But they do not include immigrants in it. They do not see the leadership that's happening. It is already happening. I think this is one of the examples where academicians, they kind of catch up. Things are happening already, and then they try to go and do research on it, right? And so what I'm saying is, let's come together as scholars and practitioners, right? And people in the communities to find new ways of documenting and opening up new areas of collaborations, right? So we can really talk about more truly multicultural spaces and not just separate communities, because it's so hard to do that. If you're talking of 100-some groups, right? We're not talking of these islands. We're talking of people who are trying to bring them together, right? On issues, on fighting for issues, fighting for their, what the problems they are facing. And especially, I just want to end with this, is at a time when immigrants and immigration as a topic, I just want you to be reminded of that again and again, is under homeland security. That says it all. If all immigrants are seen as a security problem, where are we going? I mean, in the city where about half of people are immigrants, about 40% in entire New York City, if you add to that the children who are growing up in immigrant households, it's 2/3 of the city. 2/3 of the city. And if we are placing these people as homeland security, where are we going with this, right? So I am challenging that model of looking at immigrants as foreigners and to really reach out to them and to understand them and to have more intergenerational and more intergroup dialogues. So these leaders for me are an example of those kind of people. So I want to end with that.
Thank you very much.
Perhaps we're not aware that 64% of the world's population lives in Asia and about 16% in Africa. Okay. Asia is not defined the way that the American Census Bureau defines it, right? Which mostly would involve East Asians and South Asians, but not, for instance, people in Iran or whatever, who, geographically speaking, right, are Asians, right? So the American Census Bureau redefined what it means to be Asian, which is a little bit odd, actually, in a way. Right? Furthermore, and again, just to sort of put a global light on all of this, the population of Africa is going to double in the next 30 or so years. It's the fastest growing population on Earth, and specifically in what people call sub-Saharan Africa. Right? So if you just wait till 2050 or so, the world's going to look very different, just number-wise. Never mind all the other differences that we don't really know about. Right? All right, now we're going to have our second speaker, and he's going to travel actually to another part of the world, right? Mr. Edwin Missouri, who has a master's degree, but is also a doctoral student at St. John's University. And furthermore, here at St. Francis College, we're all aware that he's our webmaster. Right? And he's going to talk about Haitian immigrants in New York.
So I'm here to talk about Haitian immigration in New York. I'll talk about my experience. I was born in Haiti. I came here when I was 7. But my transition is what led me to studying history, studying history, becoming a historian, learning more about my own history, and also about the history of people in the African diaspora. So I kind of had so I came here in the 80s, and it was very hard. New York was tough. New York was tough, a lot of crime. There were a lot of immigrants. There were a lot of jobs too, though, because that's why the immigrants came, as other older immigrants left and went to Long Island and Queens, whatever. But as an immigrant growing up in New York, it was tough, it was hard. And a lot of times I questioned, myself, my skin color, my history, not being able to speak English also was a big barrier. But what I found interesting is being immigrant of African descent in New York, where there's a lot of people of African descent who were here, as Americans, African Americans who were here. I thought it'd be an easier transition. I'll talk a little bit about Haiti. So, as a child in Haiti, we didn't have much, and I didn't know about what we didn't have. One of the things I remember about coming to New York was tasting orange juice for the first time, or feeling the cold, the weather change from warm to cold, and that always stuck with me. So, my parents immigrated to New York. I'd say when my father left when I was born, so I didn't know my father till I was 6, when he went to Haiti and brought me here. And I didn't grow up. I didn't know my mother either until I came to New York. So I was with my grandmother in Haiti, and she had to bear the burden of caring for my sister and I as an older person. My memory of Haiti is not about poverty, but it's just what we had, right? Never had toys. I had to make my own toys. I think, as an immigrant, not having makes you appreciate having. And I'm not saying that all immigrants feel that way, but in my case, I did. So, I spent a lot of time playing with dirt, cooking dirt. And I had a slide, but maybe I'll show some of the pictures from the slide later. But let's talk about my transition in New York. My father would have left us back home, but he wanted better opportunities for my sister and I in terms of education. So when I think about, actually, I teach at St. Francis here, and I have my students do an immigration project, and their parents or grandparents just pick an immigrant and interview them. So one of the questions I have them ask is, what would you be doing if you hadn't left your home country? So I think about that a lot when I look at myself. I'm privileged. What would I be doing if my father had left me in Haiti? I'd be a farmer. Probably would not have much of an education. So that's why I kind of, even though I had a hard transition, I appreciate my experience in New York and in the United States. So once I arrived here, I wasn't only hit by the cold, but I was also hit by my experience with other people of African descent, who I just, by looking at them, I wouldn't know that there was a difference between them and me. and we'll talk about, later on I can talk about why I feel from like studying history, why their mentality, which I consider an American mentality, how that came about. So one of the things is learning English. I had an accent. I had a hard time pronouncing didn't. I would just say, I didn't do it. I didn't, like kind of like a Frenchman. So that made me, no matter how hard I tried, but my accent, always gave me away, as a Haitian. So, at first, I went into public schools. Well, I spent 1 year in public school, and they had a program that helped PS 181. It's in Flatbush, Brooklyn. That's where we landed on Nostrand Avenue, of course, which is like the gateway to, once you come into the United States, before you go off to Boston or back down to Miami or wherever. But one thing that the other students who were not Haitian started calling me was, you're an African. Or they would say, Haitian body odor, kind of like, or African body odor, that African stink or Haitian stink, because of, our language connects us really directly back to Africa, including our culture. Whereas in America, Americans kind of, whether they're white or black, are kind of forced or encouraged or nudged into feeling this American pride. Even though, looking at the other African Americans, I'd be like, you're in the same place as me. When you look at this country, because if we walked into a store at the time, which, if a young black man walked in the store, he'd be surveilled. So like, we're in the same place, but why am I feeling this animosity or hatred towards your Africanness and my Africanness? So I spent years fighting, years running, years hiding, to try it until I got to the point where my English was good enough where I could pass as an American. But at the same time, I'm like trying to, ask myself, where is this coming from? Where is this hatred of other people coming from? And one thing, like looking back, that I found is sometimes the abused abuse. So then I started delving into history. I can't, we don't have time to go through how I got into history. But as a Haitian, I didn't even know how rich Haitian history was in terms of their fight for freedom and their fight against white supremacy. So that's how I ended up looking into history, going into African American history, looking at American history. And you're spoken about immigration and how we should try to bring people together. But when you look at how the West was colonized, it was to take over another land and remove other people from that land. But then at the same time, as I study psychology, I can see how people who did that would fear other people because they would think that these other people will do, non-white people will do the same thing that was done to either African Americans or Native Americans. So that's something that has to be studied, psychologically. How do Americans or Europeans see themselves for what happened, in terms of what happened in the past? What impact did Europe, does America, even right now, have on other people, where these people probably would have to flee their homes to come here? But as an immigrant, I appreciate everything that I have here. And I think most people around the world will be jealous at what Europeans were able to build in America, right? Where now it's becoming a fortress. But like Dr. Gielen said, there's some things you can't stop. The demographics can't be stopped. So it doesn't matter how many wars you create or how many walls you build, eventually the dam will break. So even though I'm here to talk about Haitian immigration, I guess later on we could talk more about my experience as an immigrant, but all what I'm talking about now ties to my experience. The fear of others, right? Abuse of others, and then the abusers abusing others. So as an immigrant, I was here at the time when, there wasn't an anti-Arab or anti-Muslim sentiment. It was purely anti-African, anti-Black. But now things have changed as more people are forced to come to America. So my transition was hard, it was tough. I ended up becoming an American, and now that I have children here, so one of the things I think about, I didn't think about, is that now my children are really African American, right? So if my children went to Haiti, they would be like, these people are African American. They're not Haitian. So, but how will my children end up becoming part of America? Because their skin color won't change. Which is how we can we compare the old immigrants to the new immigrants, and then you have the old immigrants who are the British and the Scots. But then later on, you had the Irish and the Italians, but their skin color allowed them to become American. So right now, I think the immigration policy is more anti-skin color versus anti-immigrant. Because when you think about the children of immigrants who are from Europe, when those children are born, they're going to be allowed to pass. But will a child of 2 Asian immigrants be allowed to pass to the next level? How hard will it be for them to move on? But now, Flatbush, Brooklyn is one of the best places to live. Brooklyn is one of the best places to live. Now if you drive down Nostrand Avenue, right across the street from where I first moved, you have high rises coming up, and the demographics are shifting too as you have gentrification. So that's another topic for another time. Anyway, thank you.